Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling.
Chapter
Chapter 2,
3, I think.
3.
Continuation.
Dad was going frantic. It's only him and an old warlock called Perkins in the office, and he had to do memory charms and all sorts to cover it up. But your dad, this car, Fred laughed. Yeah, Dad's mad about everything to do with muggles. Our shed's full of muggle stuff. He takes it apart, puts spells on it, and puts it back together again. If he raided our house, he'd have to put himself straight under arrest. It drives Mom mad. This is the main road, said George, peering down through the windscreen. We'll be there in 10 minutes. Just as well, it's getting light. A faint pinkish glow was visible along the horizon to the east. Fred brought the car lower, and Harry saw a dark patchwork of fields and clumps of trees. We're a little way outside the village, said George. Ottery's sand catchpole. Lower and lower went the flying car. The edge of a brilliant red sun was now gleaming through the trees. Touchdown, said Fred, as with a slight bump they hit the ground. They had landed next to a tumble-down garage in a small yard, and Harry looked out for the first time at Ron House. Here's the picture. It looked as though it had once been a large stone pigsty, but extra rooms had been added here and there until it was several stories high and so crooked it looked as though it was held up by magic, which Harry reminded himself it probably was. 4 or 5 chimneys were perched on top of the red roof. A lopsided sign stuck in the ground near the entrance read "The Burrow." Around the front door lay a jumble of Wellington boots and a very rusty cauldron. Several fat brown chickens were pecking their way around the yard. It's not much. It's brilliant, said Harry happily, thinking of Private Drive. They got out of the car. Now we'll go upstairs really quietly, said Fred, and wait for Mom to call us for breakfast. Then, Ron, you come bounding downstairs going. Mom, who look turned up in the night? And she'll be all pleased to see Harry, and no one need ever know we flew the car. Right, said Ron. Come on, Harry. Asleep at the... Ron had gone a nasty greenish color, his eyes fixed on the house. The other 3 wheeled around. Mrs. Weasley was marching across the yard, scattering chickens, and for a short, plump, kind-faced woman, it was remarkable how much she looked like a saber-toothed tiger. Said Fred. Oh, dear, said George. Mrs. Weasley came to a halt in front of them, her hands on her hips, staring from the one guilty face to next. She was wearing a flower apron with a wand sticking out of the pocket. So, she said. Morning, Mom, said George, in what he clearly thought was a jaunty, winning voice. Have you any idea how worried I've been? Said Mrs. Weasley in a deadly whisper. Sorry, Mom, but see, we had to. All 3 of Mrs. Weasley's sons were taller than she was, but they cowered as her rage broke over them. That's empty! No note! Car gone! Could have crushed! Out of my mind with worry. Did you care? Never. As long as I've lied. You wait until your father gets home. We never had trouble like this from Bill or Charlie or Percy. Perfect, Percy, muttered Fred. You could do with taking a leaf out of Percy's book, yelled Mrs. Weasley, putting a finger in Fred's chest. You could have died. You could have been seen. You had lost your father's job. It seemed to go on hours. Mrs. Weasley had shorted herself hoarse before she turned to Harry, who backed away. I'm very pleased to meet you, Harry, dear, she said. Come in and have some breakfast. She turned and walked back into the house, and Harry, after a nervous glance at Ron, who nodded encouragingly, followed her. The chicken was small and rather cramped. There was a scrabbled wooden table and chairs in the middle, and Harry sat down on the edge of his seat, looking around. He had never been in a wizard house before. The clock on the wall opposite him had the only hand and no numbers at all. Wooden round the edge were things like time to make tea, Time to feed the chickens, and you're late. Books were stacked 3 deep on the mantelpiece. Books with titles like Charm Your Own Cheese, Enchantment and Baking, and 1-Minute Feasts. It's magic, and unless Harry's ears were deceiving him, the old radio next to the sink had just announced that coming up was Witching Hour with popular singing sorceress Celestina Warbeck. Mrs. Weasley was cluttering around, cooking breakfast a little haphazardly, throwing dirty looks at her sons, and she threw sausages into the frying pan. Every now and then she muttered things like, "I don't know what you were thinking of," and never would have believed it. "I don't blame you, dear," she assured Harry, tipping 8 or 9 sausages onto his plate. "Arthur and I have been worried about you too. Just tonight we were saying we'd come and get you ourselves if you hadn't ridden back to Ron by Friday. But really," she was now adding 3 fried eggs to his plate. "Flying an illegal car halfway across the country. Anyone could have seen you." She flicked her wand casually at the washing up in the sink, which began to clean itself, clinking gently in the background. "It was cloudy, Mom," said Fred. "You keep your mouth closed while you're eating," Mrs. Weasley snapped. "They were starving him, Mom," said George. "And you?" said Mrs. Weasley, but it was with a slightly softened expression that she started cutting heavy bread and buttering it for him. At that moment, there was a diversion in front of a small red-hatted figure in a long nightdress who appeared in the kitchen, gave a small squeal, and ran out again. "Jenny," said Ron in an undertone to Harry, "my sister. She's been talking about you all summer." "Yeah, she'll be wanting your autograph, Harry," grinned Fred, but he caught his mother's eye and bent his face over his plate without another word. Nothing more was said until all 4 plates were clean, which took a surprisingly short time. "Blimey, I'm tried," yawned Fred, setting down his knife and fork at last. "I think I'll go to bed, and—" "You will not," snapped Mrs. Weasley. "It's your own fault you've been up all night. You're going to dig the garden for me. They're getting completely out of hand again." "Oh, Mom! And you too," she said, glaring at Ron and George. "You can go up to bed, dear," she added to Harry. "You didn't ask them to fly that wretched car." But Harry, who felt wide awake, said quickly, "I'll have Ron. I've never seen a gnoming." "That's very sweet of you, dear, but it's all dog work," said Mrs. Weasley. "Now let's see what a Lockhart's got to say on the subject." And she pulled a heavy book from the stack on the mantelpiece. George groaned. "Mom, we know how to gnome a garden." Harry looked at the cover of Mrs. Weasley's book. Written across it was fancy gold letters. There were words, "Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests." There was a big photograph on the front of a very good-looking wizard with wavy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. As always in the wizarding world, the photograph was mooing. The wizard, who Harry supposed was Gilderoy Lockhart, kept winking cheekily up at them all. Mrs. Weasley beamed down at him. "Oh, he's marvelous," she said. "He knows his household's pests. All right, it's a wonderful book." "Mom, fancies him," said Fred in a very audible whisper. "Don't be so ridiculous, Fred," says Mrs. Weasley, her cheeks rather pink. "All right, if you think you know better than Lockhart, you can go and get out with it, and we'll betide you if there's a single gnome in the garden when I come out to inspect it." Yawning and grumbling, the Weasleys slouched outside with Harry behind them. The garden was large, and in Harry's eyes, exactly what a garden should be. The Dursleys wouldn't have liked it. There were plenty of weeds, and the grass needed cutting, but there were grand trees all around the walls, plants Harry had never seen spilling from every flower bed, and a big green pond full of frogs. "Muggles have garden gnomes too, you know," Harry told Ron as they crossed the lawn. "Yeah, I've seen those things. They think they are gnomes," said Ron, bent double with his head in a peony blush. "Like fat little Father Christmases with fishing rods." There was a violent scuffing noise. The peony blush shattered, and Ron straightened up. "This is a gnome," he said grimly. Get off me, squealed the gnome. It was certainly nothing like Father Christmas. It was small and leathery looking, with a large knobbly bald head exactly like a potato. Ron held it in arm's strength as it kicked out at him with its horny little feet. He grasped it around at the ankles and turned it upside down. This is what you have to do.